Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third lab, the endocrine system. So as we go through this lab, note this is the last lab before our first exam in lab, which is given during the time of our lecture test for the online course. So as we go through this, also count this as part of some review for lecture materials as well, since we'll talk about a lot of the glands and their secretions here as well. So what we want to get started with is remind ourselves some things. If you guys have watched my lecture in then you've seen we were discussing that you have the endocrine system controls the body. Just kind of now we have another system that does that. And that was the nervous system, and the nervous system and the endocrine system both control the body, but they do so very differently. Remember, the nervous system used neurons with their neurotransmitters as a chemical messenger. Here we are using a chemical messenger called a hormone, and these hormones that they make, remember in lecture we talk about how they have a very specific shape, and this shape that they have can determine the function that it has. So it can go on to a receptor, and that receptor was on a target cell, and that target cell can respond to do whatever the hormone says. It responds to the effects of a hormone, so the hormone binds to it and it affects it. Now remember what we saw was, now I can't draw that here at the moment, but in my lecture, if you go back to my lecture, you can see that my drawing on that is that, so we drew something kind of looked like a cloud representing an endocrine gland. And when we drew that cloud representing an endocrine gland, we saw that that endocrine gland secreted hormones, and it went to the space around all the secretory cells. And what do we talk about those gland cells? There's an extracellular space around those cells, and that goes out into the fluids around the cell, and eventually it makes it to the bloodstream, diffuses in the bloodstream. So why does it do this? Is because endocrine glands do not have ducts. And that is very important. We can see the distinction here is that endocrine does not have ducts. We saw in lecture that exocrine has ducts. Now these hormones, they'll go into the bloodstream through a blood vessel, they'll diffuse into a capillary, they'll get through the bloodstream, they'll travel through the entire bloodstream, and when they get released to tissues, they'll make it to a target cell, and they can go to that target cell because it has a receptor we saw in lecture, and it binds to that receptor and it stimulates that cell. Now we saw mechanisms of that. For example, in lecture, we saw that you might have this hormone passing through the cell membrane and binding to an organelle like the mitochondria or the nucleus, and affecting the organelle itself, maybe stimulates that organelle to do something or inhibits that organelle to do something. And it might affect some other metabolic activities. It might cause the cell to produce more enzymes or less enzymes. It might make the cell grow or make the cell not grow, right? And we saw a variety of these things, and that stimulation or inhibition of the metabolic activities of a cell is what allows each hormone to do its basic functions. So like with antidiuretic hormone, if it binds to a cell in the kidneys and causes it to retain water, well, it has to do something to its metabolism to cause it to affect water gain or water loss. And there's some really cool mechanisms behind that. I wish our book went into it. I always keep thinking I'm going to do a video on that someday and discuss it. But what we want to see is so kind of starting off, we saw this diagram in lecture. The purple images, purple glands will be our primary function here with one exception, and that's the gonads. But the purple ones and the gonads is ones we're going to focus on. Now, this is every tissue in the body that secretes some hormones, at least the big hormone secreting tissues. Not every single tissue out there who can secrete a hormone, but what we'll see is, guys, your hypothalamus, which is up there. Now, if I zoom in just for reference, this is your thalamus, and your hypothalamus is just below the thalamus, and we'll see what it does. And below the hypothalamus is your pituitary. Behind the thalamus and a little inferiorly will be the pineal gland. Then we will see our thyroid and parathyroid glands here in the neck, and our thymus gland. Then if we were to go on top of our kidneys, we will find our adrenal gland. Behind the stomach, nestled here in the small intestine's loop, and here associated to the stomach is our pancreas. Then down here in the male, there are the testes, and in the female, down in the lower abdomen, pelvic cavity, will be the ovaries, and those are the gonads. So these are all tissues, endocrine glands, and remember, they secrete into the blood. Endocrine secretes endo blood. Endocrine, endo blood. All right, so we said we know where the hypothalamus is, up in the brain below the thalamus. We know in lecture that this is a gland that makes anti-diuretic hormone, ADH, anti against, diuretic. Diuresis is making urine. It is a hormone who is against making urine. So what does that mean? It concentrates urine, okay? ADH. Oxytocin. Either we will give it OXT or OT. Most of you in your field, if you go into healthcare, will probably see OT most of the time. That does not stand for overtime. It stands for oxytocin. And they are made in the hypothalamus, produced by hypothalamus. Remember, they are stored in the posterior lobe of pituitary. We'll talk more about that later on. Then we'll see, guys, that the hypothalamus produces releasing hormones. What is releasing hormones? These are hormones that cause the release of something from the anterior pituitary. Here you could see some releasing hormones, for example, might come here, and they might enter the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to release some of its control hormones. And we saw a great example. We saw thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus comes down to the anterior pituitary to cause anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, and then thyroid stimulating hormone will go on to the thyroid gland to make the thyroid gland release T3 and T4. Now, we also will see that there's inhibiting hormones. And these inhibiting hormones, like growth hormone inhibiting hormone, will inhibit the release of growth hormone, things like that. So these are hormones that inhibit the release of some other things. So the releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones regulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. That's why we had the hypophyseal portal system in lecture. We saw the hypophyseal portal system allowed us to control that. It ensured that any regulatory hormones from the hypothalamus can make it to the anterior pituitary first and control the regulation and release of those hormones. Now, our pituitary gland. Here, we saw that all the hormones from the pituitary or the hypophysis was M goat flap. That was all of them. M goat flap. Now, the pituitary gland, remember, has two lobes. It has a lobe called the Adeno Hypothesis or Adeno Hypothesis. What does that tell me? Anterior lobe of pituitary, Adeno Hypothesis. What does that mean, guys? This is saying that adeno is, when you see the word adeno, like adenomatous or adenomatous polyps, you're talking about that these are associated to glands. This is the glandular pituitary. This is the one that is made up of gland cells. It's the anterior pituitary. Now, the hormones here are 7 of them. It's M flat pig. I in pig stands for ignore, but I wanted it spelled flat pig. Okay, it was just a mnemonic. I like to use mnemonic devices. Now, the first one, ACTH. ACTH. Got one of the biggest names here. Adreno corticotropic hormone. What does this mean? Adreno, adrenal gland. Cortico, cortex. So this says this hormone is telling me it goes to the adrenal cortex. Now think back to lecture. It is tropic. A tropic hormone is if I've got a gland and it releases a hormone, and that hormone goes to another gland to make that gland release a hormone. The first hormone was tropic. So this hormone here, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is released from the anterior pituitary, goes to the adrenal cortex, and makes the adrenal cortex release its hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. It tells you exactly what it does. It is a hormone that stimulates the thyroid to release T3, T4. So this is stimulatory TSH, stimulatory of the thyroid. Melanocyte stimulating hormone would tell you that it stimulates melanocytes. Those are the cells that make melanin, that give us the darker pigments to skin tone. Follicle stimulating hormone. Now, in lecture, I mentioned that there's some things inside of the female's ovary called follicles that will mature because you get a hold of a follicle stimulating hormone. Now, you will see this, guys, in the reproductive system at the very last. Luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone. That's the one, for example, in males, I said it makes men like hairy apes. It causes us to release our sex hormones, our testosterone. Growth hormone. Growth hormone makes you grow, and prolactin makes milk produce. You make milk produce the milk. So if you think back, oxytocin makes milk ooze, prolactin makes milk produce, so you must produce prolactin before oxytocin in order to have milk to be able to suckle. Now, adeno hypothesis, adeno hypothesis or adeno hypothesis, M flat pig, MSH, M FSH, L LH, A ACTH, T TSH, P prolactin, PRL, I ignore, G growth hormone. M flat pig. That'll help you get every one of them down. Easier to remember, okay? Now, the neurohypophysis, that's the posterior part. Remember that up in the hypothalamus, there were cell bodies, neuron cell bodies, that went down into the stalk, the infundibulum, and entered into the posterior pituitary. Those were neurons, and their synaptic terminals we saw were sitting on a series of blood vessels. So what you will see here is, guys, the neurohypophysis stores and releases that ADH. It's stored and released. It was made in the hypothalamus, stored and released in the posterior pituitary gland. That's because they are stuck in vesicles in the synaptic terminals found within the posterior lobe of the pituitary neurohypophysis. Now, it stores ADH, it stores oxytocin. To get those neurons down, there's a stalk that holds the pituitary gland onto the hypothalamus called the infundibulum. And inside the infundibulum are capillaries that allow the hypothalamus regulatory hormones, allows those, what we saw, the releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones, to go into the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and that was the hypophyseal portal system. Now, in lecture, I talked about that. Here in the lab, our lab structure sheets don't really go into that as much as I will in the lecture, but these are capillaries that connect. So you have a capillary connection and a physical connection. Infundibulum allows the neurons to pass in. Hypophyseal portal system allows hormones, releasing hormones, to go into your anterior lobe. Okay. So as you can see, there is an anterior lobe of the pituitary referred to as the, and it has different parts, but we're not going to worry about that. But what we have is referred to, guys, as the anterior lobe or the adeno hypothesis. Easy to remember. A for adeno hypothesis, A for anterior lobe. And then posterior lobe is neurohypophysis, as it is continual with the neurotissue of, so those neurons up here in the hypothalamus will come in here. So that's where you had the supraoptic nucleus and paraventricular nuclei all bring their axons down into the posterior lobe where they release in. Okay, now, Hypophyseal portal system, I just want to briefly mention that it's the capillaries here that allow any releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus to enter into this, to go straight to the anterior pituitary cells and allow these cells to be turned on or turned off before it ever got to general circulation. That was something we talked about in lecture. Now, thyroid. Thyroid was in your neck. Now, we say the thyroid gland. We know the thyroid gland releases thyroid hormones. T3, T4. T3, triiodothyronine, also called thyroxine. Here, or sorry, T3 is not thyroxine, it's triiodothyronine. Thyroxine is tetraiodothyronine. I apologize that my so T3, thyroxine or tetraiodothyronine, T4, and then calcitonin. Now, calcitonin, though released by the thyroid, is not T3 or T4, so it's not the thyroid hormones that were amino acid hormones we saw in lecture. Okay, it's a peptide. Now, what we saw is also there is the lateral lobes on each side of this gland, and connecting the two sides together, the two lateral lobes, there's a bridge of tissue between called the isthmus of the thyroid. Okay, so be able to identify these parts on models. I will use that. Now, the parathyroid glands, if we look at the back of the thyroid, you will see generally four. There's usually four normally. There may be more, but there's normally four, two on each side, called parathyroids. There's two pairs, four normally on the back, and it makes parathyroid hormone PTH. Remember, that's the hormone that causes the breakdown of bone and the release of calcium. The adrenal glands, or suprarenal glands, as I prefer to call them, supra, above, renal, kidney, on top of the kidneys. You will find them sitting on top of the kidneys here. And the suprarenal gland, if we cut it open, we're going to see a set of layers to them. So since they're on top of the kidney, here we have part of the kidney, and the layers, the outermost layer, the capsule, is protective. There's no hormones by the capsule, but then the layer underneath that, the cortex, releases a slew of hormones. Then there's the deeper medulla. Now, the cortex can be divided into three zones. In lecture, I showed the three zones a little bit better. And we talked about that there are three there. And the mnemonic that I use there is remember, like, so let's say if you had a daughter and she starts dating. So what do you find out when her boyfriend's coming over to pick her up for the first time? You are going to say, if you're her daddy, get my freaking gun right away. Get my freaking gun right away. Get my. Zona glomerulosa, get my, makes mineralocorticoids. Glomerulosa makes mineralocorticoids. That's aldosterone. Get my freaking gun. Fasciculata makes glucocorticoids. That's cortisol. And zona reticularis, right away. Reticularis makes androgens. Get my freaking gun right away. Then now the medulla is epinephrine, norepinephrine. Okay, we already know that from the autonomic nervous system, that the suprarenal medulla was a location of ganglionic neurons, visceral motor neurons. And we saw in that lecture that was the only location where there were postganglionic neurons were short in the sympathetic division. Pineal gland is in the back of the brain here, and this little back of the brain here has cells we talk about called pineal sites. The pineal sites we saw release melatonin. The thymus we saw produces thymosin or thymosins. These are going to turn on your T cells, turn on your immune cells. They're going to cause appropriate immune responses. It is a small gland here in the mediastinum located between the two lungs, just a little superior to the heart and located behind the sternum. Now the pancreas. Now, since we drew this in lecture, I'm not going to be able to draw it right now. I don't have the ability to where I'm actually doing this lecture. But because I'm in a different place today. So what we're going to see, guys, is so if you go back and look at it, you'll be able to see the islets again. Now remember, the endocrine pancreas, this is endocrine. This means it secretes into the blood. There is exocrine cells in the pancreas. We'll talk about that. Now remember, the pancreas makes a few things. It makes glucagon, insulin, pancreatic polypeptide, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay, that's the things it does. Now remember the acini cells. Acini cells, these cells are exocrine cells. That means they secrete into the duct. Here you can see a duct in this gland. And at the end of this gland, acini cells, and then this duct, acini cells will make digestive enzymes that will enter into the duct and go out into the digestive tract. But the islets, remember the islets is endocrine. Islets is endocrine. And these cells, remember, the cells of the pancreatic islets are kind of like a party. And remember at a party, who is always the center of attention at a party? A beautiful woman. So we know that beta cells always get all the attention because that's the big one that makes insulin. So we know it's kind of the center of attention here, right? And who is it that always surrounds beautiful women? Alpha males. And we saw that the alpha cells surround the beta cells, and we saw that was an example of paracrine communication in lecture. And what we saw is, guys, that these alpha cells make your glucagon, but your beta cells make insulin. And you beta know that beta cells make insulin. Beta cells make insulin. And what happens is these are two opposite hormones. Glucagon breaks down the sugars. Remember in lecture I said when glucose is gone, glucagon. That glucagon, which is released when my blood sugar is low, it raises sugar. One of the main things that it does, one of the big roles it has, is it will take glycogen, a polysaccharide made up of a bunch of glucoses. Sorry, I logged in using Google on this computer I'm using and to check mail, and it's now giving me alerts about all my YouTube stuff. Okay. Now, your beta cells make insulin and they lower blood glucose. And glucagon, alpha cells make glucagon to raise glucose. We saw that glycogen was a polysaccharide of glucose. So if you can break a glucose off of it, or help break it down, you're going to get glucose up. Now, insulin we saw gets glucose in. One of the things we saw that insulin did was alter some cells' permeability to glucose. Now, delta cells. Delta cells produce hormones that are identical to growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or very similar to it. They act like it. Now it's like, why would that be done with the pancreas? Pancreas is a major metabolic organ for the body. It is involved in helping us to digest materials. It handles a lot of our metabolic activities. So what better thing to help us say, I don't need to grow right now because I don't have the nutrients to do so. Okay. F cells make pancreatic polypeptide, and that turns off your gallbladder, inhibits gallbladder, relaxes gallbladder. It's called pancreatic polypeptide, your F cells. Now remember, you have beautiful woman, beta cell, who is surrounded by alpha males, alpha cells. The rest of the men at the party are either dogs, delta cells, or friends, F cells. I will test you in lecture and lab what each of these cells, some of these cells secrete, what these cells secrete. I'm going to have a question. I want to say, this cell secretes what? So be able to match the cell, alpha cell, beta cell, delta cell, F cell, to its secretion. So here's a look at an islet, and typically beta cells are at the center, alpha cells are surrounding it, and you scatter your F cells and delta cells around, but that typically follows that. You can't see them. They all look the same here, but they are different. There's a way we can actually tell the difference by staining them because they're chemically different because they actually are expressing different chemicals. So Now the gonads. So gonads are testes and ovaries. Remember, the testes make testosterone, and the ovaries make estrogen or progesterone. There's not a good diagram here yet. So what I want you guys to do when you go through these and fill out all the little study guide, practice label. This image is not on the test, but this will help you study. Fill out this because I'm going to ask you what each hormone thing, different stuff secretes. And then here are the diagrams. So one of the things I want you guys to do is just label the glands first, like hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, suprarenal, testis, ovaries, parathyroids, and pancreas. And then you can come here and identify these things here, like the infundibulum, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary, if you want to put the hypothalamus there as well, the lateral lobes, and the isthmus of the thyroid as well. Parathyroids, we just saw, we identified them, but I wanted to give it a little bit bigger. It's hard to see. Now, the rest of the glands we just had to be able to identify, and actually I can, you don't have to do this one as well. I think I just didn't mean to really put it there. I can't edit where I am right now. But guys, that actually finishes it up. It is a shorter, easier lab. The lecture is one of the beastier lectures, and that's why I wanted to kind of put this with it. Is it's going to help you a little bit as you study for lecture, getting those, because you want to make sure you do know each gland, what they secrete, and some of the cells that are secreting, especially the pancreatic islets. Those are very big clinically. You'll be talking a lot about beta cells, things like that. All right, guys, this concludes my lab lecture 3, and this gets everything done for your first exam.